Raymond Garrett had not set foot inside the Caldwell Creek town dance in 6 years, and every soul between the Rio Grande and the Cimarron River knew exactly why. The town of Caldwell Creek sat in the rolling red earth country of southwestern Kansas in the autumn of 1878, a place where the wind never truly stopped moving, and the sky stretched so wide that a man could feel small beneath it even when he stood tall. It was a cattle town, a working town, a town built on the sweat of ranchers and drovers and merchants who had carved something real out of dust and stubbornness. The streets were packed dirt that turned to mud when the rains came and cracked into pale plates when the sun baked them dry again. There was a general store owned by the Harriman family, a smithy run by a large, good-natured German named Otto Brauer, a hotel that doubled as the best restaurant within 40 miles, and a schoolhouse that had been sitting empty for 3 months because the last schoolteacher had packed his bags and moved east, claiming the prairie wind was making him lose his mind. Raymond Garrett was not the kind of man who invited conversation about himself. He was 31 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who spent their days on horseback always became weathered, with hands that were rough from rope and rain, and a face that had been burned brown by a decade of sun. He ran a modest cattle operation on a spread of land about 7 miles south of town, the Garrett Ranch, which he had inherited from his father at the age of 22, and had built into something respectable through nothing but discipline and long hours. He employed 2 full-time ranch hands, brothers named Hector and Domingo Vargas, who had come up from Texas and stayed because Raymond paid fair wages and treated them like men, which was not always the custom in those days and should be spoken plainly as the injustice it was. The Vargas brothers were Mexican, and the casual cruelties they endured in town from certain quarters were things Raymond had no patience for. He had more than once put himself between one of them and a man who thought his words carried a right they did not carry. Raymond was respected in Caldwell Creek, but he was not considered warm. He was the man you called if your fence line was disputed or your cattle had strayed into someone else's pasture, because he understood the land and he understood fairness, and he never lost his temper over small things. But he had a quietness to him that some people read as coldness, and he had one habit that the town had long since stopped trying to talk him out of. Every autumn, when the harvest moon came up fat and orange over the Kansas plain, the town of Caldwell Creek held its annual harvest dance. It was the social event of the year, held in the grain warehouse at the edge of town, which was swept clean and decorated with paper lanterns and bundles of dried corn. The fiddlers came from 3 counties over and the dancing went on until midnight. Every family in town came. Every rancher, every farmer, every shopkeeper, every traveling merchant who happened to be passing through. Everyone came to the Caldwell Creek harvest dance. Everyone except Raymond Garrett. For 6 years, he had ridden into town on the night of the dance, picked up whatever supplies he needed at the general store while it was still open, tipped his hat to whoever greeted him, and ridden back out before the first fiddle was tuned. He was polite about it. He never made a show of leaving. He simply was never there. People talked, because people in small towns always talked, and the story they had settled on was this. 6 years ago, Raymond Garrett had been engaged to a woman named Clara Whitfield, the daughter of the town banker. They had been the golden couple of Caldwell Creek, the kind of pairing that made older women clasp their hands together and say that some things were simply meant to be. Clara was beautiful and clever, and she laughed at things in a way that made the whole room feel warmer, and Raymond had loved her with the quiet ferocity that was the only way he knew how to love anything. They had planned to marry in the spring. They had danced together at the harvest dance, and everyone had watched them and felt something like joy. 2 weeks later, Clara Whitfield had gotten onto the eastbound stage with a traveling musician who had come through town playing at the hotel, and she had not come back. She had written Raymond a letter, which he had read once and then burned in the kitchen stove of the ranch house, and he had not spoken her name in public since. Her father had been so shamed by it that he had sold the bank and moved his family to Wichita within the year. The harvest dance had been the last place Raymond Garrett had been truly happy in the company of others, and so he had decided, in the quiet and permanent way of a man who makes a decision and does not revisit it, that he would not go back. 6 years. He was not bitter in an obvious way. He worked his land, he was fair to his men, he helped his neighbors when they needed it, and he ate his supper alone most nights and read by lamplight from the small collection of books his mother had left behind when she passed. He was not unhappy in the grinding way. He was simply closed, the way a good leather saddlebag is closed, stitched tight against the weather. Then came October of 1878, and with it, the new schoolteacher. The school board of Caldwell Creek had been writing letters to a placement agency in St. Louis for 2 months, and what arrived in response was not at all what they had expected. They had expected a man, or perhaps a spinster of a certain age who had resigned herself to the frontier. What stepped off the eastbound stage on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October, with 2 large leather trunks, a carpet bag, a box of books so heavy that the driver nearly dropped it, and an expression of calm determination that suggested she was absolutely certain of herself and absolutely uncertain of nothing, was Beatrice Chandler. Beatrice Chandler was 26 years old. She had been born in Cincinnati, Ohio, had been educated at a women's seminary in that city, and had been teaching school in a small Missouri town for 3 years before she decided she wanted something more. More what, she was not entirely sure. More space, perhaps. More challenge. More of whatever it was that lay at the edge of the map where the towns got smaller and the sky got bigger. She had read everything she could find about the territories and the western settlements, and she had a practical, earnest quality that had made her an excellent teacher, a quality that expressed itself as a refusal to be frightened of things simply because they were unfamiliar. She was not a delicate woman, not in the way that word was used to mean fragile. She was slender with dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up practically at the back of her neck, and she had green eyes that were startlingly direct, the kind of eyes that made people feel she was paying attention to them in a way that most people rarely were. She had a small scatter of freckles across the bridge of her nose from the journey west, and she wore a plain traveling dress of deep blue wool that was sensible and slightly dusty from the road. She stepped off that stage and looked at Caldwell Creek with those green eyes and said, quietly, to no one in particular, because the stage driver was already wrestling with her trunks and there was no one else yet beside her, "Well, here we are." The first person to greet her was Agnes Harriman, the wife of the general store owner, who had been the one to arrange the schoolteacher placement, and who had a gift for being wherever something was happening. Agnes was 50, sharp-minded, kind-hearted, and the unofficial social director of Caldwell Creek. She came down the boardwalk with her hands out in a wide, genuine smile, and she said, "Miss Chandler, welcome to Caldwell Creek. I'm Agnes Harriman. I'm so very pleased you have come. You have no idea how pleased." "I am glad to be here," Beatrice said, and shook Agnes's hand with the firm grip of a woman who had decided long ago that a soft handshake communicated the wrong impression. "You are younger than I expected," Agnes said, with the directness of a woman who had nothing to gain from being indirect. "But that is perfectly all right. Come, let us get you settled. Your rooms are above the hotel, and I believe you will find them comfortable." The town took notice of Beatrice Chandler the way a small town takes notice of anything new, which is to say completely, immediately, and with a great deal of commentary. The women assessed her with cautious warmth that grew into genuine warmth as they discovered she was sensible and kind, and had a sense of humor that was dry and quick. The men were respectful, because Agnes Harriman had made it quietly but unmistakably clear that the schoolteacher was not to be bothered with any nonsense, and the few who thought to test the boundary of that instruction discovered that Beatrice herself was perfectly capable of communicating her own expectations without any assistance. She opened the school the following Monday, and within 2 weeks, the children of Caldwell Creek were learning with an enthusiasm that their parents found remarkable. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography and a little history, and she did it with the kind of patient rigor that made the children feel clever for keeping up rather than stupid for not knowing. Raymond Garrett knew none of this firsthand, because Raymond Garrett did not come into town often. He heard about it from Hector Vargas, who had ridden in for supplies on the second Friday of October and come back with flour and coffee and news. "There is a new schoolteacher," Hector said, pulling the bags from the pack horse in the yard. "A woman, Miss Chandler. They say she is very good. The Hernandez children like her." "Is that right?" Raymond said, which was not a question, and went back to repairing the fence post he had been working on. He heard about her again 2 weeks later, from Agnes Harriman herself, who had the habit of sending a jar of preserved peaches out to the Garrett ranch every autumn by way of the mail rider, along with a short letter covering the town news, because Agnes believed that men who lived alone needed someone to keep them informed of the world, whether they asked to be or not. The letter that year mentioned Beatrice Chandler in 3 separate paragraphs, which Raymond noted without comment. It was a practical matter that finally brought him into contact with her. The 3rd week of October brought with it a problem. Someone, and it was suspected to be the Dooley boys who lived on the North Road and were at an age where causing trouble felt like a calling, had broken 2 of the schoolhouse windows. The wind had come through and scattered the papers from the children's desks and warped the floorboards where the rain had gotten in, and the school board was scrambling to arrange repairs. The carpenter in town, old Mr. Fitch, had broken his wrist the week before and could not do the work. Agnes, who served on the school board, had sent a message to Raymond Garrett because he had a reputation for being able to do most things that needed doing, and because she was not above using social pressure when practical need required it. Raymond arrived at the schoolhouse on a Thursday morning with a wagon bed full of lumber and a toolbox, and a general reluctance about the whole business that he kept to himself, because he had said he would do it, and he was going to do it. The school day had already started. He could hear voices inside as he pulled up. He had planned to start with the outside frame of the windows and make as little disruption as possible. He was measuring the first window frame when the door opened and a woman stepped out carrying an empty water bucket, and they nearly collided. She startled back a step. He caught himself and took a step back from the frame. There was a brief moment of mutual reorganization. "I beg your pardon," she said. "My fault," he said. "I should have knocked. I am Raymond Garrett. Mrs. Harriman sent me about the windows." She looked at him with those green eyes, not with the fluttered assessment he sometimes got from women in town who seemed to feel they ought to perform a reaction at the sight of a reasonably presentable man, but with a straightforward, interested attention as if she were cataloging useful information. "Mr. Garrett, I am Beatrice Chandler. Yes, I knew someone was coming. I am glad you are here. The children are cold. I will have the frames in by midday," he said. "Can I bring you coffee? There is a pot on the stove inside." He had been about to say no because he did not make a habit of accepting hospitality on jobs, but she had already turned and gone back inside, and a minute later she reappeared with a tin cup that steamed in the autumn air, and she held it out to him with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had decided a thing and was not interested in debating it. He took the cup. "Thank you. The children will be quiet," she said. "I have given them their reading work. You will not be disturbed." And then she went back inside, and that was the end of it, and Raymond Garrett stood at the window frame with a tin cup of coffee and a peculiar feeling that he could not immediately name. He worked steadily through the morning. She appeared twice more, once to ask if he needed anything and once to send a boy named Thomas out to hold a board while Raymond nailed it, which was practical thinking he appreciated. She taught her class with a clear, firm voice he could hear faintly through the new glass, a voice that asked questions and waited for real answers, a voice that had warmth in it even when it was being instructive. At midday, as he had promised, the windows were in. He packed his tools and loaded the scraps onto the wagon bed. She came out again to look at the work, pressing her hand against the new glass and nodding. "That is very well done," she said, and she meant it simply, without any of the false enthusiasm some people used when trying to be complimentary. "It will hold," he said. She looked at him directly again, that steady green gaze. "Mrs. Harriman tells me you have been in this county a long time." "Most of my life," he said. "Do you like it here?" It was not the kind of question he was usually asked, and it stopped him for a moment. "Yes," he said, after a pause that was honest rather than slow. "The land suits me," she nodded, as if that made complete sense to her. "I find that I like it too," she said. "More than I expected, actually. The sky is enormous." "You get used to it, and then you cannot imagine a smaller sky," he said, and was mildly surprised that he had said it. She smiled at that, a quick, genuine smile that changed her face in an interesting way. "I hope that is how it goes for me," she said. "Well, thank you, Mr. Garrett. The children thank you." He tipped his hat, climbed onto the wagon seat, and drove back toward the ranch. He thought about that smile for 3 days before he admitted it to himself. He was not a man who indulged in sentiment easily. He had worked very hard, after Clara, to become someone who did not lean on things that could be taken away. But there was something about Beatrice Chandler's directness that bypassed the usual defenses he maintained without seeming to try to. The way water finds a path through stone, not through force, but through persistence and inevitability. He came into town the following Saturday for supplies, which was not unusual. He found himself stopping in front of the schoolhouse, which was closed for the weekend, for reasons he did not examine. He went to the general store and conducted his business, and was on his way back to the wagon when he encountered Beatrice on the boardwalk, coming out of the hotel with her carpet bag, apparently heading somewhere. "Mr. Garrett," she said, with the slight upward inflection of someone who is pleasantly surprised. "Miss Chandler," he said, "where are you headed?" "The Simmons farm. 3 of my students live there, and Mrs. Simmons has been ill. I thought I would take some soup and check on the children." "That is a 2-hour walk from here," he said. She looked at him calmly. "I am aware of that." "I am going past the Simmons Road on my way south," he said. It was true. It was also true that the Simmons Road was not particularly on his way to anywhere he needed to be, but she did not need to know the full accounting of his route. "I could take you." She considered him for a moment, not the shy, pleased to be offered consideration of someone who expected to be driven places, but the practical consideration of someone weighing whether the offer was sensible and fair. "That would be very helpful," she said. "Thank you." She climbed up onto the wagon seat without any fuss, settled her carpetbag between her feet, and folded her hands in her lap. As they drove out of town onto the packed dirt road that ran south through the golden autumn grass, she asked him questions. Not personal questions, not prying questions, but thoughtful questions about the land, about the cattle business, about how the grass grew back after a hard summer, about which direction the storms usually came from. She was learning the country. He found himself answering in longer sentences than he usually used with anyone, and he found that the sentences came easily. She told him about her students, which ones were quick and which ones were struggling, and what she was doing about the ones who were struggling. And she described these children with a warmth and specificity that made it clear she had paid attention to each of them as individuals. He knew most of the families and filled in details she found useful. "A mile before the Simmons Road," she said. "You know this place very well." "Born here," he said. "Is your family still here?" "No," he said. "My parents both passed. I have a sister in Abilene. We write sometimes." She did not offer the conventional sympathy that usually followed that kind of statement, which was a relief. Instead, she said, "It must be something to have built a life in the place where you were born. Most people I know have moved at least once, many of them twice or 3 times. I thought about moving," he said. "After my father died, I could have sold the ranch. There were offers. Why did you stay?" He thought about it. Because it was mine, he said after a moment. Not just legally, I mean something earned. I knew every inch of that land. I knew where the water ran deep and where it ran shallow. I could not hand that over. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the grass that rippled gold and brown in the October wind. I understand that, she said. I do not have a place like that yet, but I think I am looking for one. He let her off at the Simmons farm gate and told her he would come back in 2 hours, because the walk back in the failing afternoon light was not sensible. She thanked him and went up the path to the farmhouse door, and he sat a moment on the wagon seat watching her go, this woman with the auburn hair and the direct eyes and the carpet bag full of soup, and then he clicked to the horses and drove on. He was back in 2 hours exactly. The harvest dance was 3 weeks away. Agnes Harriman was the one who mentioned it to Raymond, which he had been expecting because Agnes mentioned the harvest dance to him every year with the tenacious optimism of someone who believed that if she simply kept asking, eventually the answer would change. She found him at the general store on a Wednesday morning and said, without preamble, "The harvest dance is the 4th Saturday of October, Raymond. I hope you are planning to attend this year." "I appreciate the invitation, Agnes," he said, which was his standard answer, and turned back to examining a coil of rope. Agnes looked at him for a moment with an expression he did not see because his back was to her. Then she said, with the careful casualness of a woman who was absolutely not being casual, "Miss Chandler has mentioned that she has never been to a proper frontier harvest dance. I thought it might be a lovely introduction for her to the community." Raymond set down the rope. "I am sure she will enjoy it," he said. Agnes let that sit for a moment and then said, "Yes, I am sure she will," and moved on to other business. He told himself it did not matter. He had not attended the dance in 6 years, and there was no reason to attend it now. He had made a private peace with the way things were. His evenings were quiet and his mornings were productive, and there was nothing wrong with the shape of his life. He told himself this with decreasing conviction over the following 2 weeks, during which he found reasons to be in town more often than strictly necessary, and discovered on 3 separate occasions that his route happened to take him past the schoolhouse at a time of day when Beatrice Chandler was likely to be either arriving or leaving, and on 2 of those 3 occasions he had exchanged a few words with her. And on the 3rd, he had held the door of the general store open for her while she was carrying a large stack of geography books she had ordered from the supply catalog in Wichita. "You ordered these yourself?" he asked, looking at the stack. "The school board budget does not cover everything," she said. "The children needed proper geography texts." He had looked at the stack of books and the slight strain in her arms carrying them and had taken them from her, which she allowed with a nod of thanks, and carried them to the schoolhouse. Inside, the room was arranged with care, the desks in a proper order, maps pinned to the wall, a beautifully written alphabet stretching across the chalkboard in her clear, rounded hand. The room smelled of chalk dust and pine resin from the new window frames he had put in. She showed him where to set the books and said, with the slightly impulsive quality of someone saying a thing because it is true rather than because it is prudent, "I think this is the best classroom I have had. I know it is small and I know it needs work, but there is something about the light in the afternoon through those west windows." He looked at the windows he had installed and felt, to his own bemusement, a small pride of ownership in them that was entirely out of proportion to the task. "The light in this country is something specific," he said. "Yes," she said. "I noticed that the first day. I have been trying to describe it in letters home and I cannot find the right words. It is too big for the words I have." "You will stop trying after a while," he said. "You just let it be what it is." She looked at him with an expression that was warm and thoughtful and slightly searching, as if she were reading something in him that he had not intended to put on the page. "Mr. Garrett," she said, and then stopped. "Miss Chandler," he said. She smiled a little. "Nothing. Only I am glad you are the one who fixed the windows." He drove home that evening with the orange autumn sunset at his back, and arrived at the ranch to find Hector Vargas sitting on the porch step whittling, and watching his approach with the attentive expression of a man who has drawn a conclusion. "You were in town a long time," Hector observed. "I had business," Raymond said. Hector said nothing, which was its own form of commentary. That night, Raymond sat in the kitchen by the lamp and thought about the dance. He thought about it with the practical, honest part of his mind that he tried to use when he was solving a problem on the ranch, not the defensive, closed part that had made the decision 6 years ago, and maintained it out of something that he was beginning to think was less about dignity and more about fear. He thought about what Clara had been to him and what she had done and what he had made of it, and he was honest enough with himself, in the quiet of his own kitchen, to admit that he had made a wall of it. A practical wall, a tidy wall, but a wall. He thought about Beatrice Chandler saying, "I think I am looking for one." About the way she had looked at the October sky through the schoolhouse window as if she were taking inventory of something precious. He thought about whether he was the kind of man who could go to a dance. He decided he was going to find out. He rode into town on the afternoon of the 4th Saturday of October, which was the day of the harvest dance, having done the morning's work on the ranch, and cleaned up with more care than he usually bothered with, having found and worn the good jacket his mother had given him 15 years ago that still fit because he had not changed shape very much. Having polished his boots to a condition that Domingo Vargas had noticed and commented on with a raised eyebrow, and a grin that Raymond pretended not to see. He left his horse at the livery and walked up the main street with his hands in his pockets, taking in the town as the afternoon went golden toward evening. The grain warehouse at the edge of town already had its paper lanterns strung and glowing in the early dusk, and he could hear the fiddlers tuning, 3 distinct voices of violin arguing gently with each other toward a common pitch. People were beginning to gather in their good clothes, the women in their best dresses and the men in their cleaner shirts, children already running between adult legs. He stood at the edge of the street for a moment. His chest felt something complicated, a tight, reluctant feeling that he breathed through and stepped past, the way you breathe through cold water when you have to cross a river. Then he walked toward the warehouse. Agnes Harriman saw him first. She was standing by the door talking to 2 other women from the school board, and she went quiet and stared at him with the startled, delighted expression of someone witnessing an event they had given up expecting. Then she recovered herself and said, with considerable dignity and only a slight tremor of triumph in her voice, "Raymond Garrett, I am very glad you are here." "Good evening, Agnes," he said. She stepped forward and took his arm in a way that was both welcoming and proprietary and said, in a lower voice, "She is inside already, over near the punch table, talking to the Simmons family." He thought about saying something to the effect that he had come for himself, and not for any particular reason connected to the schoolteacher, and he thought about it for about 2 seconds, and then decided that Agnes Harriman was not a woman who was served by those kinds of deflections. "Thank you," he said. He went inside. The warehouse was warm with bodies and lamplight and smelled of dried corn, and the punch that Mrs. Bauer made every year with apple juice and something else she never disclosed. The fiddles were tuning in earnest now, and couples were beginning to arrange themselves on the cleared wood floor. He moved through the room with the careful attention of someone navigating something unfamiliar, nodding to people he recognized, which was nearly everyone, and receiving their surprised, pleased, carefully restrained reactions to his presence with more equanimity than he had expected to feel. He found her at the punch table. She was wearing a dress he had not seen before, a deep green that suited her coloring in a way that was almost argumentative, as if the color had decided to prove a point. Her auburn hair was dressed differently than it was at the school, not the practical pin at the back of her neck, but something softer and more deliberate, a few curls at her temples. She was talking to Mrs. Simmons and doing it with the warm, genuine attention she gave everything, and Mrs. Simmons was laughing at something she had said, and then Beatrice looked up and saw Raymond across the room. There was a moment, a specific and irretrievable kind of moment that both of them understood the significance of, in which surprise and recognition and something warmer than either of those things crossed her face in quick succession, and she smiled. Not the quick, professional smile she used in general sociability, but the other one, the one that changed the whole character of her face. He crossed the room. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "I did not expect to see you here." "I had it on good authority that the dance was worth attending," he said. She looked at him steadily. "And were you convinced by the authority or by your own judgment?" "Some of both," he said. Mrs. Simmons, who was a perceptive woman, found a reason to move away at that precise moment, which Raymond appreciated. Beatrice accepted a cup of punch from the table and handed him one, and they stood for a moment with the noise and warmth of the dance around them. The fiddles found their agreement and launched into a reel, and the floor filled with couples. "Have you danced before?" she asked him. "Not in a while," he said, which was both technically true and the most understated thing he had said all year. "Then we are evenly matched," she said. "I was taught dancing in Cincinnati, but I suspect a Kansas harvest reel is a different animal entirely." "It is," he said. "Are you willing to find out?" She looked at him with those green eyes and said simply, "Yes." He took her hand and led her onto the floor. He had been afraid. He realized that the dance would feel like a wound reopened, that the music and the lamplight and the motion would pull him back into the memory of 6 years ago and all the things that had collapsed in the aftermath of that night. But it did not. Instead, what it felt like was something much stranger and much better. It felt like the present tense, like a thing happening now, in this room, with this particular woman whose hand was warm in his, and who was learning the patterns of the reel with a quick, laughing intelligence that was completely her own. She made mistakes, because the Kansas harvest reel was indeed a different animal, and each mistake she turned into a joke at her own expense, catching herself and correcting with a self-possession that was attractive in a way that had nothing to do with vanity. He guided her through the patterns and found himself smiling, genuinely smiling, in a way that his face had apparently not been doing much of lately, because twice in the space of an hour different people looked at him and did a small double take, as if surprised by the expression. They danced 3 dances in a row, which was noticed, because everything in a small town is noticed. They rested for one, standing together by the side of the floor drinking punch and talking about very ordinary things, the state of the school supplies and the weather coming in from the north and whether the Simmons children were going to catch up in their arithmetic. And through these ordinary things something extraordinary was quietly happening, which was that 2 people were deciding, in the wordless, certain way that people decide these things, that the world was better with the other person in it. Toward the end of the evening, when the fiddles had settled into slower, more deliberate melodies, he offered his hand for a slower dance. She took it without hesitation, and they danced in the lamplight with the paper lanterns making golden pools around them, and her hand was steady in his, and his hand was at her waist with the careful respect of a man who understood exactly what he was holding, which was something new and worth protecting. He walked her back to the hotel at the end of the evening because the streets after a dance were not a place for a woman to walk alone, and they stood at the foot of the hotel steps in the cool October night with the stars enormous and close above the Kansas prairie. "Thank you," she said, "for the dances." "Thank you for attending," he said. "The dance, I mean." She smiled at the sky above them for a moment. "I am glad I came west," she said, not looking at him, but meaning something he understood. "So am I," he said. She looked at him then, and there was a long, clear moment between them, and then she said good night and went inside, and Raymond Garrett stood on the street in the October cold feeling like a man who has been standing in a dim room for years and has just noticed a window. He rode home under those enormous stars, and he thought about what it meant to open a window after years of keeping the shutters closed. And he thought it probably meant being willing to be cold sometimes, and maybe being willing to let the light in even when the light was inconvenient, and he thought he was possibly willing to do both of those things. He told Hector Vargas the following morning that the dance had been fine, which Hector received with an expression that suggested he already knew everything important about how the dance had gone and did not need further elaboration. The weeks that followed had a quality to them that Raymond recognized, that forward-tilting feeling of waking up in the morning, with a reason to be curious about what the day would bring. He found proper reasons to be in town, actual reasons, business with the feed store and a matter with the county land office, and a conversation with the blacksmith about the condition of his stock horses. But he found them with a consistency that suggested his reasons were partially selected, because they had a reasonable chance of occurring at a time when he might encounter a woman with auburn hair and green eyes carrying an armload of geography books. They did not court in any formal sense in those first weeks, because formal courtship required a certain announcement of intention that Raymond was not quite ready to make, and that Beatrice, he sensed, was watching him to see if he would approach. She was not a passive woman. She was not waiting to be chosen the way some women were taught to wait. She was watching to see if he was the kind of man who was worth choosing in return, which was a different and more interesting posture entirely. November came in cold and gray, and with it, a development that nobody in Caldwell Creek had anticipated. A group of cattle barons operating out of Dodge City had been quietly buying up land south of Caldwell Creek all summer, and in November they moved openly. Their foreman, a hard, efficient man named Crane who wore a good hat and a bad expression, came to town with a letter from his employers and presented it to the mayor, who had very little actual authority in such matters. And the gist of the letter was that the company intended to run a large cattle route through the southern end of the valley, and that several small operations in the way would need to make arrangements. The Garrett Ranch was squarely in the way. Raymond received a letter of his own, which he read at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with the calm, flat expression of a man whose anger is a controlled burn rather than an open fire. The letter offered to purchase his land at a price that was insulting in the particular way that an offer is insulting when it is designed not to be accepted, but to establish a starting position for a pressure campaign. He rode into town and spoke with the county land office. His deeds were in order. His boundaries were registered and clear. He had the older Vargas brother, who had sharp eyes for reading faces, accompany him, because Hector had an instinct for when something was being misrepresented that Raymond trusted. The land office confirmed that Raymond's claim was legally sound, and that no eminent domain had been declared, and that the company had no legal mechanism to force a sale. This was reassuring and not entirely reassuring, because men with enough money in 1878 Kansas sometimes found mechanisms that the law had not yet caught up with, and Raymond knew it. He dealt with the situation the way he dealt with most situations, which was directly and without complaint in public and with his own counsel in private. He updated his fences. He made sure his deeds were copied and held in 2 separate places. He wrote a letter to a lawyer in Wichita whose services he had used before. He got on with his work, but Beatrice had heard about the letter, because in Caldwell Creek the news of a threat to a local ranch was the kind of news that moved at speed, and she came to find him one afternoon when he was at the general store. "I heard about the land company," she said, without preamble, which was characteristic. "It is manageable," he said. She looked at him in the way she looked at things she was thinking carefully about. "Is it genuinely manageable, or are you saying so because you do not want to worry anyone?" He looked at her for a moment. "Both," he said, "but mostly the first. What do they want, exactly?" He told her what the letter had said and what the county had told him and what his legal position was, and she listened with the complete attention she gave things, not fidgeting, not interrupting, absorbing. When he finished, she said, "You need other voices with you. Not just your own legal position, but the standing of the community. If they are trying to push multiple small operations out, The others should know, and they should stand together. He looked at her. "That is a good thought," he said. "I know a great deal about collective argument," she said, with a slight dry quality. "I was part of a teachers' organization in Missouri that spent 4 years petitioning the school board for better materials and wages. The principle is the same." He arranged a meeting at the grain warehouse for the following Thursday, with the other ranchers who had received similar letters, and the meeting was attended by 11 men and 3 women who ran operations in the valley. Raymond laid out his legal information. A rancher named Pickard had been approached separately about a different section, and a farmer named Hollies on the eastern side of the valley had gotten a third letter with a slightly different angle. Together, the letters revealed a pattern. A lawyer from Wichita agreed to come down and advise the group collectively. The land company's campaign stalled. When it became clear that the valley landowners were organized and legally advised, and not going to fracture and sell individually under pressure, the campaign lost its leverage. By December, the company had withdrawn and turned their route plans elsewhere. The injustice of large capital trying to displace small operations through pressure and below-market offers was not resolved in any larger sense, because that kind of power continued to operate throughout the territories in those years, and the people who suffered most were often the ones without the legal standing or resources to fight back, which included many of the Mexican ranch hands and small farmers who had even less protection than Raymond did. But in this particular valley, in this particular autumn, the organized community held, and the land stayed with the people who had earned it. Raymond acknowledged this in public at the closing meeting, saying plainly that the situation would have gone differently if it had been Hector or Domingo Vargas facing the same letter, because they did not have the same legal standing in the county and the company would have known it. He said it because it was true, and saying it was the least he could do with the advantage he had. Several people were uncomfortable with the statement and 2 agreed with it, and the count was roughly what he expected it to be. In December, with the land business settled and the school term progressing, and the prairie locked in its winter gray, something shifted between Raymond and Beatrice. It was not a dramatic shift. It was more like the difference between watching ice on a river and the morning when you realize the ice is moving, when the whole surface has been advancing so slowly and so steadily that the movement becomes visible only once it is already complete. They had been talking, meeting in town, occasionally riding out together on a Saturday afternoon when she wanted to see more of the country, and he found himself offering to take her, and there was a warmth between them that had stopped being casual without any formal announcement of having done so. He had ridden out to the schoolhouse one Friday afternoon in December, ostensibly to check that the window frames had not settled badly in the cold, which they had not and he had known they would not, and she had been grading papers by the window in the last of the afternoon light, and he had come in out of the cold and knocked the mud off his boots at the door, and she had said, "Sit down. I will be finished in 5 minutes," in the tone of someone who had decided that he was allowed to be in her space without ceremony, which was an intimacy of a particular kind. He sat at one of the student desks, which was somewhat too small for him, and looked around the room. The geography books he had carried for her were arranged on the shelf. The alphabet on the chalkboard was still in her hand. On the side wall there was a crudely drawn map of Kansas, the counties labeled in various children's handwriting. Next to it, carefully pinned, was a student essay titled "My Family" by a girl named Lucia Hernandez that had a small red check at the top and the written comment in Beatrice's script, beautifully expressed. She finished marking and set down her pen and looked at him. "The windows are fine," she said. "I can see that," he said. "Then why are you here?" The question was perfectly direct and perfectly kind. There was no accusation in it. It was a genuine question from someone who wanted a genuine answer. He looked at her across the small room with its chalk dust and its geography books and its fading afternoon light. "I wanted to see you," he said. The stillness that followed was the stillness of something decided. She held his gaze with those green eyes, and then she said quietly, "I wanted to see you too. I have been for some time." "I was not easy to see," he said, "for a while." "I know," she said. "I did not push." "I noticed that," he said. "I was grateful for it." She picked up her pen and set it down again, a small, unconscious movement. "I heard something," she said carefully, "about a woman named Clara. I did not hear it from anyone who ought to have told me, and I am not asking about it. But I want you to know that I understand that some absences are not about what is happening now." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "No, they are not. But sometimes the absence becomes about the present eventually if you let it." "Have you let it?" she asked. "I am trying to," he said. She looked at him for a long, clear moment. Then she said, "That is enough. Trying to is enough." He rode home in the early dark of the December evening with the cold air clean in his lungs, and something open in his chest that had been closed for a very long time. And he thought that trying to was probably a more honest beginning than any of the false certainties he had used before. He began calling on her properly in January, which meant that he spoke to Agnes Harriman, who was the closest thing Caldwell Creek had to Beatrice's family of record in the community, and Agnes received this information with a composure that was only slightly undermined by the smile that she could not entirely keep off her face. He asked Beatrice if she was willing to receive his calls, and she said yes, without any of the coy performances that convention sometimes demanded. Just yes, directly and warmly, the way she said most things. He called on her on Saturday evenings, sitting in the small parlor of the hotel's second floor that Agnes had arranged for her use, and they talked for hours. He talked more in those Saturday evenings than he had talked in some years collectively, he thought. She drew conversation out of him not by asking prying questions, but by being genuinely interested in everything, in the way the cattle operations worked, and the history of the county, and his mother, who had been a schoolteacher herself in a small way, which surprised both of them when it came out and made Beatrice laugh with delighted recognition. She told him about Cincinnati, about her family, about her father, who was a printer, and her mother, who read every book her father ever printed and could argue the contents of any of them. She told him about the women's seminary, about the teachers' organization, about the injustice she had seen in Missouri of children of color being barred from schoolhouses and what she thought of it, which was exactly what Raymond thought of it and which he said so plainly. And then they spent a considerable amount of time talking about what could be done and what was being done and what was not being done that should be. And the conversation had a heat and a substance to it that both of them found deeply satisfying. He kissed her for the first time in February, on a Saturday evening at the end of a call at the hotel stairs. It was not an impulsive kiss. He had been thinking about it for some time, and she had been, he suspected, aware that he was thinking about it. And when he took her hand at the foot of the stairs and she looked at him with those steady green eyes, there was a shared quality to the intention of the moment that made the actual kiss feel like an arrival rather than a beginning, like the completion of a movement that had started months ago in a schoolhouse with cold windows and a cup of coffee. She put her hand against his chest briefly and said his name very quietly, Raymond, and he said her name, Beatrice, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed to be said right then. He was almost home before he realized he was smiling in a way he could not stop, and he thought about Clara for just a moment, not with bitterness, not anymore, but with a distant clarity, the recognition that what he had felt then had been real but had not been this. This was different. This was steadier and stranger and more like the land itself, something that would not move when you pushed it, something that had roots. By March, the whole of Caldwell Creek had come to a general understanding about Raymond Garrett and the schoolteacher, and the general understanding was that it was a very good thing and about time. Agnes Harriman expressed the town's view to Raymond directly, as was her custom, one morning at the general store, saying, "She is exactly right for you, and if you have the sense God gave a reasonable man, you will not let her get away." "I appreciate the advice, Agnes," Raymond said, which was not meaningless. "I mean it," Agnes said, "and she is very good for this town. The children are learning more than they have in years. I would like her to stay." "So would I," he said. He asked her one Sunday afternoon in March, when they had ridden out south of town to a rise in the land where you could see the whole wide sweep of the valley, the brown and green of the early spring, the sky immense and layered above it, the ranch visible in the distance as a cluster of buildings that looked like something carved from the earth itself. He had brought a blanket and she had brought the remains of a lunch they had eaten at the rise, and they were sitting side by side with the spring wind cool and the light late afternoon gold, and he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him, steady as always. "Ask me," she said. "I want you to marry me," he said. And then, because he had thought about how to say this and had decided to say all of it, "I know this country is hard. I know the ranch is not a comfortable life in the way you were raised to think of comfort. I know that the school is yours and your work is yours, and I do not want you to give it up, and I am not asking you to. I am asking you to build a life here with me, on this land, in this place. I am asking because I love you, and I am not afraid to say it." Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass around them. A hawk was turning in wide circles in the blue distance. She looked at the valley and at the ranch in the middle distance and at him, and in her green eyes he saw the calculation she was making, not a cold calculation but a full one, the weighing of a person who takes things seriously and wanted to make sure she was saying yes to the whole truth and not to a version of it. "I would keep the school," she said. "Yes," he said, "and you would not expect me to be something other than what I am." "I fell in love with what you are," he said. "It would be very inconvenient to start expecting something different." She laughed at that, the real laugh, the one that came from somewhere genuine. Then she said, "Yes, Raymond, yes, I will marry you." He took her hand and held it, and they sat on that rise above the valley in the spring light, and neither of them needed to say anything more for a while, because the thing had been said, and it was real, and the country stretched out below them as if it approved. They were married in June of 1879 in the Caldwell Creek church, on a day that was warm and blue and smelled of the wild grass that the spring had turned from brown to a vivid, living green. Beatrice wore a dress of ivory muslin that Agnes Harriman had helped her order from Wichita, and she carried a small bundle of prairie flowers that Lucia Hernandez and 2 other students had collected that morning and presented to her with enormous solemnity. Raymond wore his good jacket and a clean white shirt and stood at the front of the church with Hector Vargas beside him, because Hector was the closest thing he had to a brother, and it seemed right. And when Beatrice came down the aisle, she looked at him with those green eyes, and what was in them was not nervousness or performance but something plain and certain, love without apology or decoration. And he felt the same thing move through him that had been building since October, since the dance, since the windows, since the tin cup of coffee in the October cold. The minister read the words and they said the words back to him, and Raymond put a plain gold band on Beatrice's finger that had been his mother's, which Beatrice had said yes to immediately when he offered it. And they were married, and the church, which held most of the town of Caldwell Creek, made a sound of genuine collective happiness that started as a proper silence and broke into something warmer and less contained. The celebration afterward was at the grain warehouse, which was becoming a familiar venue for the events of their lives, and there was food contributed by half the families in the county, and there was dancing, and Raymond danced with his wife at the Harvest Dance venue in June and felt only the present tense, warm and real and entirely his. Beatrice moved to the ranch, but she kept the school. Agnes Harriman managed the logistics of the arrangement with the school board, making the case that a married woman could teach as well as any other, which was not the universal opinion but was Agnes's opinion, and she held it with considerable force. The school board, which was sensible enough to know that Beatrice Chandler was the best teacher the school had had in memory, agreed that the arrangement would continue. The ranch in that summer of 1879 was different with her in it. Not dramatically different, not transformed, but livened in specific ways. She organized the kitchen shelves and ordered books from the supply catalog, and planted a kitchen garden behind the house with an efficiency that Hector Vargas admired and said so. She learned to ride with more confidence on the quarter horses Raymond kept for general use, and she rode out with him on Sunday mornings across the ranch, with the ease of someone who had decided to love a thing and was following through on the decision. She talked to Hector and Domingo Vargas with the same direct, genuine interest she brought to all conversations, and they responded with the warmth of men who were unaccustomed to being seen as full persons by everyone in their orbit, and who recognized it and valued it when it happened. There were conversations at the dinner table in that ranch kitchen that summer that covered more ground than Raymond had managed in years, because Beatrice had the quality of drawing people out, and because both Vargas brothers had things to say when someone was genuinely listening. The autumn of 1879 brought the harvest dance again, and Raymond and Beatrice attended it together, which was the natural and completely resolved version of the question that the year before had posed. They danced every reel and the slower numbers too, and people watched them with the fond satisfaction of a community that had been invested in an outcome and was pleased with how it had landed. That winter, Beatrice told him she was expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday evening in November after supper, sitting at the kitchen table where Raymond had been mending a piece of harness leather in the lamplight. She said it simply and directly, as she said most things, and his hands went still on the leather and he looked at her, and the thing that moved across his face was so unguarded that she reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Are you all right?" she asked with gentle amusement. "I am very well," he said, in a voice that was somewhat different in quality than his usual voice. "I am better than I have been." The baby came in July of 1880, in the heat of the summer, attended by the town doctor and Agnes Harriman, who installed herself in the ranch house 3 days before the expected date and declined to be relocated. Raymond stayed as close as he was permitted, which was not very close, and spent those hours doing unnecessary tasks in the barn with the concentrated attention of a man who cannot be still but cannot be useful. The baby was a boy. He arrived in the early morning with the summer sun just clearing the horizon, and he was healthy and complete and furious about existing, which Raymond found privately reassuring, the fury of a person with strong opinions. They named him James Garrett for Raymond's father, and Raymond held him that morning in the bedroom with the curtains open to the summer light, this small, outraged, entirely real person, and looked at Beatrice, who was exhausted and luminous, and watching him hold their son with an expression that undid him completely. "James," he said. "Hello, James," Beatrice said softly. The child opened his eyes, which were the unfocused dark blue of all new babies, and Raymond thought, with the clarity of a man who had spent 6 years behind a closed door, that this was what the door had been closed against. Not hurt, not history, but this particular thing, this terrifying and specific joy. The school continued. Beatrice took several months away from teaching after James was born, and the school board arranged a temporary replacement for the autumn term, a young man from Emporia who did an adequate job. Beatrice returned in January of 1881, bringing James to the schoolhouse in a basket for his first months while she taught, an arrangement that the children found enormously exciting, and that was practically very sensible. Life on the Garrett Ranch found a rhythm that was full and working, the rhythm of two people who are genuinely suited to each other going about the shared business of a life. They disagreed sometimes, because they were both people with opinions, but their disagreements had the quality of weather rather than damage. They moved through them and came out the other side in the same relationship they had been in before, which Raymond found, every time, both relieving and remarkable. The next October brought the harvest dance of 1881, and they attended it with James, now a toddler, who was briefly, chaotically included before Agnes. Harriman carried him off to a quieter corner and supervised his sleep in a crate she had specifically prepared. Raymond and Beatrice danced in the lamplight of the grain warehouse with the paper lanterns and the fiddles and the autumn warmth, and it was the third harvest dance they had attended together since that first one when he had crossed a room and changed the pattern of his life. The following spring brought news from Beatrice's family in Cincinnati. Her younger sister, Margaret, had married and was doing well, and her father had retired from the print shop, and her mother's health was good. Beatrice wrote long letters home and received long letters back, and she read pieces of them aloud to Raymond in the evenings. This correspondence between two worlds that she now belonged to equally, the Ohio City of her childhood and the Kansas plain of her present, and Raymond listened and felt the particular contentment of being someone's home. He made improvements to the ranch house that year, adding a proper study for Beatrice at the back of the house with bookshelves he built himself, which took 3 weeks and came out well, though he was not above seeking Hector's opinion twice on the levelness of a particular shelf. Beatrice received the completed study with the same quality she had shown at the schoolhouse windows, a plain and genuine pleasure that was better to receive than any more elaborate response would have been. In the summer of 1882, there was a dry spell that put pressure on every operation in the county. The grass went brown early, and the creek level dropped, and Raymond watched his water sources with the careful attention of a man who has seen the worst of a dry year before. He made adjustments, moved his cattle to the northern pastures where the water was deeper, reduced the herd temporarily through a sale in Dodge City that he negotiated himself at a price that was fair but not generous, because the buyers knew the drought was affecting everyone. He brought Hector and Domingo through it with him, keeping their wages intact through the difficult months by tightening every other cost, because they had families to provide for, and they had been loyal and able men, and it was simply the right thing to do. Beatrice watched him manage the crisis with the calm, methodical focus that was his particular quality under pressure, and she helped in the ways she could, which included keeping precise financial records in a ledger system she organized herself, because it turned out her father's print shop had given her a practical head for accounts. They sat together at the kitchen table in the evenings of that dry summer going over numbers together, and this too, this ordinary urgent working partnership, was a kind of love, the unglamorous and essential kind. The rains came in September and the pastures recovered, and they came through it whole, the ranch and the family and the partnership intact. James was 2 by then, a compact, determined boy who was developing his mother's directness and his father's economy of expression, a combination that the Vargas brothers found endlessly entertaining. He had taken to following Domingo around the yard with a small, serious face and a toy rope, and Domingo, who was a patient and kind man, had begun teaching him the basic theory of rope work with the same seriousness the boy brought to it, which Raymond observed from a distance with a feeling that was too full to be simple pride. The harvest dance of 1882 was attended, as always, by Raymond and Beatrice Garrett, and James was brought along and charmed the whole room and was passed from person to person like a small, dignified ambassador, until he fell asleep in Agnes Harriman's arms with the boneless total sleep of very small children, his toy rope still in his hand. Raymond danced with his wife in the lamplight, and she rested her head briefly against his shoulder during a slow number, and he held her close in the warmth of the crowded warehouse, with the fiddles playing something gentle, and the paper lanterns making their soft golden light, and he thought about the evening 6 years ago when he had stood outside this same building and chosen not to go in, and about the evening 3 years ago when he had chosen to go in, and about everything that had followed from that single choice. He thought about how a person can believe, very sincerely, that they are protecting themselves, and be wrong about what they are protecting themselves from. He had thought he was protecting himself from pain. What he had actually been protecting himself from was this specific abundance, this life that felt, on an ordinary dance floor in an ordinary town in October, like something answered. He was glad he had come in. He was glad she had come west. He held her a little closer and she looked up at him with those green eyes, the ones that had never stopped seeing him clearly, and she said softly, "What are you thinking?" "That the dance is worth attending," he said. She smiled, the good one, the real one. "It always was," she said. By the summer of 1883, Beatrice discovered she was expecting again. She told him in the same straightforward way, at the same kitchen table in the lamplight, and he received it with the same undone quality that he had the first time, which made her laugh. "You would think," she said, "that you would be more composed the second time." "I see no reason to perform composure," he said, which made her laugh more. The second child was born in the early spring of 1884, another son, whom they named Daniel after Beatrice's father. Daniel Chandler Garrett, and James was 3.5 by then, and received his brother with a cautious and proprietary interest that was very characteristic. Daniel was a quieter baby than James had been, darker-eyed and watchful, already showing at 1 week of age the quality of attending to things, looking at the world with the patient inventory that Raymond recognized as Beatrice's, translated into a new small person. Agnes Harriman, who came out to the ranch when Daniel was a week old with a hamper of food and the intention of staying for several days to help, looked at the two boys and Raymond and Beatrice in the ranch kitchen on a spring morning and said, with the satisfied tone of a woman whose investments had paid exactly the return she hoped for, "This is a very good life you have made here." "Yes," Raymond said. He was sitting at the kitchen table with Daniel asleep against his chest and James at his feet with a small carved horse that Hector had made him. Beatrice was at the stove making coffee. The morning light came in through the windows, clear and early spring gold. "Yes," Beatrice said from the stove, and she looked across the kitchen at Raymond with a smile that was quiet and certain and entirely theirs. The smile of a woman who had come west looking for the place that would be hers and had found it, had built it out of work and honesty, and the willingness to walk into a room where someone was standing apart from the rest of the world and refuse to let that apartness be the final word. The school continued. Beatrice returned to teaching in the autumn of 1884 with Daniel in the basket arrangement and James, who was now 4, attending as her most technically enrolled student. The Vargas brothers' eldest children had by this point enrolled in the school as well, and Beatrice taught them alongside the Anglo children with the matter-of-fact insistence on equal treatment that she had brought to every school she had ever run. And if some parents had opinions about this, those opinions met Beatrice's green-eyed, utterly unmovable certainty, and did not make much progress. Raymond backed her publicly and completely, at the town meeting where the matter was raised, standing and saying plainly that the schoolteacher was doing exactly what a schoolteacher ought to do, and that he had no patience for arguments to the contrary. He said it without heat or drama, the way he said everything important, and sat down, and the matter did not come up again with any force. Hector Vargas found him afterward and said simply, "Thank you," which Raymond acknowledged with a nod because both of them understood that the thank you was for more than one thing, and that the one thing that needed saying was understood. The autumn harvest dance of 1884 was attended by the Garrett family, Raymond and Beatrice and James, who was allowed to stay until 9 o'clock, and danced with enormous enthusiasm and no particular technique, running between the adult dancers with the freedom of a child who understood that this was a celebration and that he was part of it. Daniel was too young for the dance floor and was kept by Agnes in her usual appointed corner, which Agnes accepted as her natural role in the Garrett family's social life, with a pleasure that was genuine and warm. Raymond danced with James, which involved lifting him and turning in circles while the boy shrieked with delight, and he danced with Beatrice, slow and close in the lamplight, and he danced with Agnes once, a stately and slightly comic progress around the edge of the floor that made Beatrice laugh from the side. He thought, standing with his wife after the last dance with the warehouse gradually emptying and the lanterns burning low, that this was what he had been refusing for 6 years. Not a building, not a dance. This, the ordinary miracle of being in a place with the people you love, at a specific moment in time that you will remember the whole rest of your life. Every year, Beatrice said, reading his face with the accuracy she had developed over 5 years of paying careful attention to it. We will come every year. Every one, he said. She took his arm and they walked out into the October night, the stars overhead in the enormous Kansas sky, the cool air carrying the smell of dry grass and the faint distance of wood smoke from the town's chimneys. James was riding on Raymond's shoulders, nearly asleep, his small hands loosely gripping the hat he had placed on his father's head. Agnes walked beside them to the livery with Daniel in her arms, and at the livery she transferred the sleeping baby to Beatrice with the practiced ease of a woman who had handled more babies than she could count. "Good night, Agnes," Beatrice said, and leaned forward to kiss her cheek. "Good night, my dear," Agnes said, and watched them load the wagon and drive out toward the south road, the 2 boys asleep among the blankets in the wagon bed, the man and woman on the seat with their shoulders closed together, the October stars doing what October stars in Kansas have always done, which is shine with a particular cold clarity that makes everything beneath them seem both very small and very much worth the effort of being. Raymond drove the familiar road home with the night air on his face and Beatrice's hand warm on his arm and the sleeping weight of his boys behind him, and he thought about the particular shape of a life that could have been different at a dozen decision points. If he had not come back the morning Agnes called on him to fix the windows, if he had ridden past the Simmons Road on that October Saturday, if he had stayed outside the grain warehouse for the 6th year in a row instead of breathing through the cold water of it and walking in. He thought about all the versions of himself that had not made those choices and felt something uncomplicated and vast, a gratitude that was too simple to be called anything else, for the specific evening in October when he had decided to be a man who went into the room. "You are very quiet," Beatrice said. "Thinking," he said. "Good things." "Very good things," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder briefly, the way she did sometimes when the world was right and words were extra. The wagon rolled south on the Kansas road, the stars turning overhead in their slow, enormous wheel, and ahead through the dark the ranch house waited with its banked fire and its rows of books and its 2 occupied cradles and its long life to come, everything closed and whole and entirely, completely, beautifully sufficient. The harvest dances came every year after that, and every year after that Raymond Garrett was there. He was there when James was 5 and 7 and 9 and 12, and finally 17, and dancing with the Miller girl on the far side of the floor while his parents watched from the side with the tender, slightly resigned pleasure of parents watching their children move away from them toward their own lives. He was there when Daniel at 4 fell asleep standing up against a post and had to be carried home. He was there in the years when the wheat came up full, and the years when it did not, through the dry years and the wet years, and the years when the political news from the East made everyone in Caldwell Creek angry or hopeful or both at once. He was there in 1886 when Agnes Harriman's husband passed of a winter fever, and Agnes, who was iron in the face of most things, was briefly human in her grief at the dance that autumn, and Beatrice sat beside her for an hour holding her hand while Raymond brought her punch and talked to her about her husband who had been a good man, and Agnes said, "You know, I always knew. From the very first time I saw him at that schoolhouse window, I always knew." "Did you?" Raymond said. "I did," Agnes said, and looked at him with the particular self-satisfaction of a woman who had been right about something important for years. He was there in 1889 when Beatrice received word that her father had died, quietly, in Cincinnati in his sleep, and the autumn dance that year was bittersweet in the specific way that celebrations are bittersweet when they are shaded by absence. But they went because Beatrice said her father would have wanted her to dance, and they danced, and it was both sad and good, which is the true nature of most things. He was there in 1891, when James, now 11, stood at the edge of the dance floor with the precise self-consciousness of a boy who has just begun to understand that the dance floor means something, and Raymond went and stood beside him and said quietly, "It is not as complicated as it looks." And James said, "How would you know? You did not go for years," which Raymond received as the absolutely fair accounting it was and did not argue with. He was there when they were 50 and 60, Raymond a little more gray and a little more lined, Beatrice's auburn hair threaded with silver that suited her in a way that the color had always suggested it might, both of them slower in the dancing and entirely unashamed of it. The town had changed around them, new families arriving and some old ones leaving, a rail spur coming in and changing the economics of the cattle trade, the school growing and eventually getting a second teacher to assist Beatrice. Caldwell Creek in 1895 was a different town than it had been in 1878, but its bones were the same bones, and its people were largely the same people or the children of those people. And at the harvest dance, every October the paper lanterns still made their warm, golden light over the grain warehouse floor. James married in 1892, a capable young woman named Ruth from the family on the eastern side of the valley, and they had children, which made Raymond and Beatrice grandparents with a completeness that arrived and settled with the naturalness of something long expected. Daniel became a lawyer, which his mother had suspected when he was 4 years old attending class in a basket with the attentive patience of a judge. And he worked first in Wichita and eventually in Topeka, and he came home for the harvest dance whenever he could, which was more often than either parent expected, and neither of them was going to complain about. In the ranch house that Raymond had improved steadily for 30 years, the study Beatrice had received with plain and genuine pleasure was full now to overflowing with books and papers, and the accumulated correspondence of a life in education. And every evening she sat there for an hour in the lamplight reading something that had arrived from somewhere or writing something that was going somewhere. And Raymond read in the kitchen at the table where he had always read. And every so often one of them would find something worth saying and say it across the distance of a room or two, and the other would answer, and the conversation of their lives went on. He had fixed a great many things on that ranch over the years, fences and roofs and pasture gates, and a barn roof that had come off in a high wind in 1888 and had to be replaced entirely. But the first windows he had ever fixed there were the schoolhouse windows, the ones he had measured on an October morning with a tin cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and a woman coming out through the door with a carpetbag. And those windows had stayed true and level for 20 years before the schoolhouse finally needed a full renovation in 1898, by which time Beatrice had been teaching in them for 2 decades. When they took the old frames out to put the new ones in, she brought one of the original window latch plates home and put it on the mantelpiece in the ranch house parlor, and Raymond looked at it one evening and looked at her, and she said, with perfect casualness, "I am sentimental about windows." "As it turns out," he said, "so am I." He was sitting in his chair by the fireplace, and she was in hers, and the fire was doing what fires do in October, casting its warm and specific light over everything in the room, the books and the latch plate on the mantel, and the 2 chairs that had been in those positions for so long that they had shaped the rug between them. And outside the October wind moved through the dry grass of the Kansas plain with the sound it had always made. A sound Raymond had heard his whole life, and that Beatrice had come to know and love in its specificity, the way she had come to know and love everything about this country, which was her country now as surely as it was his. The harvest dance of 1899 was their 21st harvest dance together, and they attended it as they had attended all the others, which was to say completely, without reservation, with all of themselves. The lanterns were the same kind of lanterns. The fiddles were different fiddlers now but played the same music. The floor was the same floor, worn smooth by 20 years of dancing feet. James and Ruth were there with their children, the oldest of whom, a girl of 6 named Margaret for Beatrice's mother, was attempting the reel with great enthusiasm and almost no success, exactly as her grandmother had 31 years ago on the night that everything changed. Raymond watched his granddaughter spinning enthusiastically in the wrong direction on the dance floor and caught Beatrice's eye, and they shared, across the room, the kind of look that only people who have been paying attention to each other for a very long time can share, layered with 20 years of shared context and common history, and the specific tenderness of people who have built something real together and know it. He crossed the room to her, as he had crossed a room to her once before. "Dance with me," he said. She took his hand. "Every time," she said. They danced in the lamplight of the grain warehouse on a Saturday night in October in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, with the lanterns burning gold above them, and the fiddles playing and the community of their lives around them. And neither of them was the person they had been the first time they had stood here. A closed man in his good jacket and a determined woman in her green dress. But the thing between them was the same thing, only larger and more settled and more certainly itself. The way a tree is the same tree at 30 years that it was at 10, only grown so deep into the ground that nothing is ever going to move it. He held her close and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they moved slowly in the way of people who are not performing dancing, but are simply being together in the best way the occasion offers. And the music went on, and the lanterns burned, and outside the enormous Kansas stars did what they always did, which was shine. Raymond Garrett had not set foot inside the Caldwell Creek harvest dance for 6 years, and then he had set foot inside it once, and then he had never missed one again, and the reason was standing in his arms, warm and steady and entirely, exactly herself. And that was the whole of it, the whole story, the whole truth, and it was more than enough.